Okay, so rhetorical tropes in defense of the indefensible, resisting abolitionists and environmentalists. So this comes out of some work that I've been doing recently on resistance in slave societies. So I spent the day reading histories about slave societies and resistance in them, and then spent the evenings watching environmental resistance. And I became interested in the connections between the two, the way that arguments about why we should not remove slavery and why we should not bother about environmental problems are quite similar in some ways. So most of this is really about the abolitionists' argument rather than the environmentalists' argument, and sorry, the resistance to the abolitionists. And most of it is focused on the British West Indies. I've got other slave societies, but this particular bit is about the British West Indies. So I'm looking at 6 particular rhetorical tropes, ways of arguments that people use that do seem to be quite similar across these two, well, apparently very different worlds. The first one is that either it doesn't exist or it's entirely natural. The second one is it does exist, but it benefits the most important people. The third one is you can't abandon this because the economy is dependent on it. The fourth one is actually slaves are better off than the domestic poor. That's why you don't need to worry about slavery. The fifth one is about, okay, so we do need to get rid of slavery, but we need to take some time over it for reasons that I'll come to in a minute. And the last one is othering, so that if you don't do this, somebody else will do it. So there's no point in you stopping it. Okay, so this is the first one. Either it doesn't exist or it's natural and therefore inevitable. So I'll just start with this quote from Aristotle. That some should rule and others should be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. Natural slaves had incomplete souls and had limited capacity for thought. Indeed, without slavery, natural slaves would be incapable of living. And then I'll just skip the next one down to Hobbes. So slavery is acceptable if sustenance and security is provided in exchange for the loss of freedom. So, you know, slaves inevitable. Slavery really is inevitable. And there's a quote from the Gentleman's Magazine, which is pro-slavery, 1804. It is to be hoped, for heaven's sakes, that we shall hear no more of abolishing the slave trade. The Negro race are but a set of wild beasts. And then we'll skip to King William IV, who was the British king who signed the Abolition Bill in 1833. He didn't actually want to sign it. He wasn't at all in favour of abolition, but his Secretary of War, Edward Ellis, persuaded him that he could sign it because it would never work, because the enslaved wouldn't work without coercion, so it wouldn't make any difference. And then we look at that in terms of the environment. This is Boris Johnson. Global leaders are driven by a primitive fear that the present ambient warm weather is somehow caused by humanity. I mean, I think he's changed his mind slightly since then, but not very much. And then he said shale gas was the best answer to the problem of Britain's looming energy shortages. And he dismissed the government's effort to replace closing coal stations with wind power and nuclear. Quote, Labour put in a lot of wind farms that failed to pull the skin off a rice pudding, he said. We now have the opportunity to get shale gas. Let's look at it. It's part of the 2020 vision we have for this city. This is when he's mayor of London. Power generation is vital. So some quite interesting arguments about whether that actually is a problem or not. I won't bother with that one. The second trope is that the problem does exist. It is real, but actually it has great benefits. Some of this is drawn from Michael Taylor's book, The Interest, which is a great book if you're interested in this area. So The Interest is West Indies lobby in British society, which represents slave owners, traders, bankers, merchants. So when slavery was abolished, something like 47,000 Brits received about £20 million in compensation, which is a huge amount at the time, about 40% of the government budget. No slave was ever compensated. Eric Williams was one of the first writers to suggest that slavery was not just about benefits to slave owners, but actually fed the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the British Empire. And Charles Tilley said that slavery fed the interests of the state as well as the interest of capitalism. So it's not just the money that comes out of slavery, it's the building of the British state in this case. So the war with the French and also the Spanish was never just about wealth from slavery, it's about other things. And there's an example of the people that benefit. Between 1787 and 1807, Liverpool, the city of Liverpool, was responsible for about 40% of European slave trade and about 80% of British voyages. Liverpool was led by slave owners. All 20 mayors and 36 out of 40 councillors during that time were slave owners, and 469 British MPs had links to slavery. So there's lots of people with fingers in troughs at this point. And when you think about it in terms of the environmental context, 46 members of the British House of Lords have got shares in or corporate roles in oil and gas, and 33 of these have got shares worth more than £50,000. And that the rest of it is just telling you the examples. This is on the right, you've got a picture of Matt Ridley. White climate change is good for the world. Don't panic. The scientific consensus is that warmer temperatures do more good than harm. In short, my children will be very old before global warming stops benefiting the world. And note that if the world continues to grow at 3% a year, then the average person will be about 9 times as rich in 2080 as she is today. So low-lying Bangladesh will be able to afford the same kind of flood defences that the Dutch have today. It's just extraordinary. Third rhetorical trope is that actually, irrespective of the moral issue, the home economy in particular is now totally dependent on slavery, and that's why you can't get rid of it. So 1701, 33% of Britain's commercial profits are derived from the African trade, mainly slavery. 1754, 78% of Jamaica is owned by just 467 plantation owners. So a massive concentration of wealth. Between 1761 and 1807, the average profit on a slave voyage was about 10%. That's about twice the yield from mortgages on property about the same time. And the cost of buying a slave could be recouped at about 18 months. So profits, generally speaking, from sugar plantations between 6 and 11% per annum. And about 12 million people were shipped from Africa, primarily to the Caribbean. And the average lifespan post-enslavement was about 7 years. And then the BLDM, this is a quote from a slave owner in Antigua. That says, "Black lives don't matter." Quote, "To work slaves to the utmost and by the little fair and hard usage, to wear them out before they become useless and unable to do service, and then to buy new ones to fill up their places." And in 1807, the British Army is the single largest buyer of enslaved people anywhere in the entire world. It bought 13,000 slaves for about £900,000, which is about £71 million now. So between 1795 and 1807, the British Army bought about 10% of all the enslaved people sold in the Caribbean, and they put them straight into the army. They didn't give them a choice. It was just out of a slave ship and into the army. Let's miss on that one. And the global dependence of fossil fuels is a similar kind of argument about why we can't get rid of this. If you're British, you will know that we've currently seen a bill going through Parliament, which has been amended by the Commons, by the Conservative government, so that we are still able to discharge raw sewage into rivers, and we're still able to ignore all kinds of particle pollution regulations set by the World Health Organization. And part of that argument about being dependent is also an argument about the costs of not being dependent. So this is a piece in the Daily Mail, which is a right-wing newspaper, about the costs of policing the Extinction Rebellion London protests recently. And the headline was, "Huge overtime bill stacks up and thousands of rest days are cancelled for the police." So now data released under the Freedom of Information rule suggests the protest cost the Metropolitan Police more than 4.5 million in overtime payments between 23rd of August and 6th of September. So it's not just that we're dependent on these carbons, but actually we can't afford to do without them, and we can't afford to police people who are protesting about them. The fourth trope is actually there is something about the relationship between slaves and our, quote, our own people. So this is an argument about charity beginning at home. This particular picture is a portrait of Sir Francis Ford's children giving a coin to a beggar boy. It's now in the Tate Britain. And what the picture is showing is that these children, the children of Sir Francis Ford, were very generously giving this poor starving beggar money. And actually the poor starving beggars in England in this particular case were better off than the enslaved people, because at least in England people cared for them. So at least in the West Indies they got all kinds of wonderful benefits allegedly, whereas in England they didn't, and they had to rely on these charitable donations from lovely rich children. So Wilberforce and the Christian abolitionists, this is the argument against them, were more interested in slavery abroad than slavery at home. This is William Cobbett, who was a radical reformer, and he denounced the Methodists for supporting Africans when, quote, he knew a dog near Salisbury that had a great deal more sense than many a Negro, unquote. So there are lots of arguments about how people in Britain need help far more than the slaves do. Dickens called this telescopic philanthropy, what he called rapacious benevolence, or what we might call now virtue signaling. He says there were two classes of charitable people. One, the people who did a little and made a great deal of noise, and the other, the people who did a great deal and made no noise at all. And there's a quote, this is from Bleak House, his novel Bleak House. Mrs. Jellyby supports the charitable projects afar, whilst nearer to home, millions of people were stuck in poverty. And this is also a great crime, she ignores her husband and children. Quote, she has devoted herself to an extensive variety of public subjects at various times and is at present, until something else attracts her, devoted to the subject of Africa, with a view to the general cultivation of the coffee berry and the natives and the happy settlement on the banks of the African rivers of our superabundant home population. So basically, Dickens is arguing that we need to look at home rather than look abroad, because things are much worse at home. There is something that doesn't directly translate, but there's an argument about what the current government is doing in terms of cutting its international aid budget, and a similar kind of argument that things are so bad here that we don't need to worry too much about what's going on abroad because of the state of the country. You don't also need to ask why the country's in a state. That's a separate argument altogether. The fifth trope, delay and civilize. This is about evolution, not revolution. So these are issues about the climate change from 2021, the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. So this is the eventual report that was put out, and some of the leaks suggested that the Saudi oil ministry had demanded phrases like, quote, the need for urgent and accelerated mitigation actions at all scales should be eliminated from the report. And it was the same with the Australian government suggesting that we should take arguments about coal out, and the same from the India Central Institute of Mining and Fuel Research suggested we should stop complaining about coal. And in the same way that Brazil and Argentina suggested we should stop worrying about beef products and animal food. So again, this is something about, we don't need a revolution here. We don't need to do anything radical. What we need to do is think very carefully. I think I've missed one out here. Oh, this is the equivalent on the slavery one. Since time is escaping, I'll just read you the top bit. This is from Canning, who was the Foreign Secretary between 1807 and 1809. And he said, this is a very common trope. So barbaric were the enslaved that he could not foresee the present generation ever achieving the requisite level of civilization to be freed. He likened slaves to Mary Shelley's recently published Frankenstein, a monster beyond self-control, quote, possessing the form and strength, but the intellect only of a child. So this is common not just amongst those people that are trying to continue slavery, but even amongst those people who are arguing that it should be abolished. But the abolition should not be instantaneous. So almost all of the anti-slavery societies tried to argue that you should abolish it, but you shouldn't do it immediately because slaves were completely uncivilized and they needed to be civilized, and that way it might be okay. And the final one, othering. If we don't do it, others will do it. So all the main slaving countries, Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal to a certain extent, justified their enslavement of Africans on the basis that if they didn't do it, others would. And one of the intriguing aspects is the legitimation used by people like John Locke, for example, usually regarded as a liberal. In Locke's second treatise on the civil government, 1699, he said, although men were born free, the Indians had no individual property rights over the land because they didn't cultivate it, that is, mix their labor with it, and thus could not have any legitimate claim over it. This is kind of doubly ironic, because the only people that actually did do the work on this land were people on slave plantations, i.e. the slaves, not the slave owners. But in effect, Locke argues the Indians have got no government because government only exists to protect property, and therefore the land could be legitimately sequestered by the colonists. And all of this despite him proclaiming that, quote, slavery is so vile and miserable in the state of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that's England, that it is hardly to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. And finally, There's the othering things. There's a picture of David Curtin on the top. The push to close coal and gas power stations and ban petrol and diesel cars in the UK when China is going to open 150 new coal power stations in the next 10 years is both insane and useless. It will severely harm the poorest people in society, but not touch the hypocritical eco jet set. So it's a really interesting combination here that the people that are really the problem are the hypocritical eco jet set rather than ordinary people that will be harmed if we don't continue with this. Okay, let me stop at that point. Thank you.
Brilliant talk. Thank you so much, Keith. And a perfect timing, really. Well, I'm expecting many questions, and for me, EU is just wow. Great presentation. Charles, would you like to ask a question, give a comment?
Thank you so much, Keith. This was fantastic. I was absolutely convinced. I have two minor points and question for you. So the minor points are that, sorry for being a bit of a geek, but Karl Marx in Capital also mentioned that slavery was primitive accumulation that led to industrial revolution. Anyway, that's a minor point. Another point is that what is crazy when you think about it is that those arguments were made in the context of the Enlightenment. That is to say, exactly when human rights were invented, and of course, England since the 17th century is probably, arguably, the place where human rights were invented. But anyway, this is kind of a historical point. My question to you is this so in terms of those discourses you extremely skillfully identify, I was thinking, okay, what are those? Are those leadership discourses? And if so, is it, of course, there's some kind of toxic leadership for sure. And if so, is it a kind of collective toxic leadership or something like that? Anyway, this is my question. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just respond to the second point first, which is about the Enlightenment. It's kind of ironic this occurs at the point of the Enlightenment. One of the most intriguing aspects is the way that Hegel doesn't talk about Haiti at the time. So the newspapers are full of the Haitian Revolution or the Saint-Domingue Revolution, and it's almost never mentioned by anybody. So there's an intriguing issue about why are all these so-called liberal Enlightenment people just ignoring what's right in front of their faces, and there's an issue there about how that comes about and what its impact is. I'll look at some of those things in the keynote that I'm doing with David. I'm going to look very briefly at what happens in Saint-Domingue and Haiti, and look at the impact of the French Revolution on that, which it might explain why Haiti becomes free and Jamaica never does. But so I'll leave that for now. On the third point, are these leadership discourses? I think they are. I think if you look at what the main politicians, both in this country and the main political leaders in Jamaica, for example, are saying, these are exactly their arguments. This is why we cannot afford to either abolish slavery, and we certainly can't, or abolish the slave trade. And if we do abolish the slave trade, it has to be on a long evolutionary pattern because these people need to be civilized. So I think they are leadership discourses. What I haven't looked at in this, and again, this will come up in the next bit, is what are the discourses of the people on the other side of the fence? So what are the discourses used by the abolitionists or used by the enslaved populations? And almost wholly, the abolitionists are arguing there is something immoral about this, but we can't just stop it. That's why what we're in favor of is, first of all, abolishing the slave trade, and then there'll be some economic changes, which means there'll be a dearth of labor, which means conditions will improve in slave plantations. That never actually happened. The other part of the argument is if we abolish the slave trade, then it will slowly die off, and that will give us enough time to civilize these people so they might be able to survive without our civilizing influence. So it's an extraordinary rhetorical argument that they they seem to be able to just blind themselves with a moral desire, and you can see that in terms of the splits between the English churches, for example. So the Church of England is very much in favor of slavery, but some of the Baptist movements that came out of the Church of England are very much against slavery. So there's a big split even within those. And there are some people that dig their way through the Old Testament to find justifications for slavery. And some people do the same and say, no, this isn't what they meant. So those kinds of arguments still continue. And what's intriguing is the split in argument that is now recurring in the environmentalist debates about whether we should do it instantly, no more carbon, no more coal mines, or whether we should do, well, just one more coal mine, and then we'll run it down slowly, and that will help everybody.
Great, thanks for your question, Charles. I also noticed that in all the examples you're providing, it's fantastic how the downsides, if we can call them the downsides of both processes, they're never articulated, they're just being explicitly avoided. We have a comment from Linda in the chat. The argument that we need to take care of issues at home before we launch into foreign aid is typical of AI activists. Also lots of parallels to treatment of tribal nations enslaved. Would you like to respond to this?
Yes, no, I think the arguments against indigenous populations are not just restricted to Jamaica or Haiti, and I think the worst thing is that they reflect right the way across the world, and it's almost as if people, proponents of enslavement or the displacement of people away from their land, are just being reproduced. There's a kind of book which says these are the 10 arguments you can use against this. And it's almost as if people across the world are using the same arguments, but filling them up with different places and different facts, but using the same rhetorical arguments. And worse than that, it's one of the so the book that I'm writing is about resistance across all kinds of areas, not just enslavement and slavery. And the worst thing is that those same kind of rhetorical tropes just recur. It's almost like the arguments that we had a few years ago about there are only 6 kind of stories that people have. It's that kind of thing. There are only 6 kind of rhetorical tropes that people use to defend what appears to other people to be indefensible.
Can we call this a certain logic, or it's rather not? It's rather the mean we use to. Not we, but people use to create their argument to.
What was the first word you used? Can we call this a what?
Logic. Can we speak about a certain logic here?
I mean, you could do. I honestly haven't been able to trace how far back these arguments go. So I've done work on Roman imperialism, so the kind of resistance to Rome in Germania and Gaul and in Britannia. But this stuff about the rhetoric didn't come until I finished those chapters. So what I want to go back now is go back and look about whether in fact Romans were using the same arguments about how they had to civilize the Britons or the Germans or the Gauls, and whether nothing has really changed. It's just the same old pattern, or whether there's a different pattern. And I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. It's very interesting work. Did you notice any dynamics in the usage of these tropes within the most recent example, maybe? Because you've been talking about you've been throwing examples from 2013 and then later from the most current climate summit. So do you see how they are being more used, some of them being more used at some periods when a certain type of social context and the activation of the discussion on the particular topic?
That's a very good question, and I haven't got that far. I haven't really looked. Well, one of the chapters I'm going to do in the future is resistance by environmental groups, but I haven't got that far. But that was a question that's certainly intriguing about why is it? And I think that what happens is there's a kind of stepwise issue. So it starts out by saying either we don't have slavery or the slaves are really happy, and then evidence emerges that the slaves actually aren't very happy, and then the argument changes. Well, they're not very happy, but they're actually better off than they are if they worked in a coal mine in the north of England, and then it changes again. So I think there is a kind of logical progression, but I haven't been able to trace that across the environmental groups.
I would be looking forward to see how it develops. Magnus, you do have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I mean, it's amazing with these rhetorical tropes over time, this kind of historical perspective. But as a sort of interested in interaction, of course, do you have any sense of, because I imagine that these tropes and the examples that you're given, they're always given in an argument. So I would be curious if you have any idea, or maybe look after, I mean, what are they arguing against? Not for, but against. What are the counter arguments against? Is there a pattern in that? Because I'm assuming that that people are producing an account to make themselves come out more, and then we can say this is awful. But I mean, what they're doing is they're producing a position as absolutely not awful. So what are they arguing against? Could we get some insights from looking at that context, the argument, the context of argument, so to speak?
Yeah, so I mean, there are at least three arguments against it used by people. One is an economic argument. This comes out of Adam Smith's work, that actually enslavement is really inefficient, and if you paid people, you'd get more labor out of them. So that's one kind of argument that is used by people. The second one is actually this is illegal. This is particularly the case in terms of when slaves are transported or freed, when they mutiny and go somewhere else, whether what you've just done was legal here but no longer legal here, and therefore that's why it should stop. And then there are attempts by the British, when the British banned the transportation of slaves, they tried to enforce a different kind of legal code. Incidentally, one of the arguments about the British attempts to remove the slave trade is that what they're doing, and first of all, why do they do it? And one of the arguments is that the sailors involved can get a huge reward. They get head money for each of the people that are freed. So it's in their interests to free slaves. And the second point is that many of those free slaves end up in the British Army because the army can't cope with malaria and yellow fever in the West Indies. So they're not being, when they're captured en route to the West Indies, they're not freed and then sent back to where they came from. They're freed, put straight into the British Army and sent to the West Indies to fight the French. So there's no resolution to this. And the third argument is a moral argument about this is against Christian ethics, and you shouldn't be doing this. And that's where the split comes in the church about whether in fact Christian religion says you can enslave people or you can't enslave people. And there's a big argument about, well, you can, but you have to be nice to them. So you have to be a nice slave owner rather than nasty one.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, Keith, for your presentation. I will be leaving this session with the 6 tropes identified, screenshot taken, notes made, and then it would be very helpful if I would be misfortunate to engage in some provocative and controversial conversation. Thank you so much. That's very useful. Thanks.
Thank you.